Good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad. Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This. Now today on the show we have Dr. Ione Jolly, who is an independent researcher and historian based in Darwin, Australia, as well as Vernon Adrian Emuang, a cultural activist. So they're here today to discuss the Eurasian community, which is very much part of the ethnic makeup of Malaysia, but often overlooked and somewhat invisible in the cultural discussion of the day, cultural and political discussion. So both of you, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Doctor, can you do my first start?
Yeah,
I have a
please,
question.
go ahead, yeah.
Because your doctoral thesis is quite fascinating. So you wrote one on Sejarah Serani, and it's actually the first PhD to be completed in this field. And I guess I'm curious to know why this is not an area that's been well researched or written on more about.
Probably because there's not many people in the community and we're not very well known anymore. So there's been quite a number of masters and honours theses on it, but not a PhD in history itself. Usually there are people within your own community, so the Chinese or the Indians and the Malays, they have a lot more historians writing about their communities, and we just don't have that, right, because there aren't that many historians within our community.
Okay.
Right. And the question of visibility is kind of important because in some ways the Malaysian story gets narrated or told in terms of the larger ethnic communities, the Malays, the Chinese, the Indians to some extent in the peninsula, and of course the Karasan Dusuns, the Dayaks and Malays of Sarawak, for instance. Vernon, you understand, and you're a Malaysian, you understand the ethnic politics. I mean, how invisible are the Eurasians of Malaysia?
I think quite invisible because we don't have a political party to front us to create the news, perhaps, and our associations, we do have them, are mainly social and perhaps maybe not as outward looking as we could be. So the kinds of activities that the community does are a little bit, I think, insulating perhaps, and could be engaging with the larger Malaysian community at large. And this year we hope to be doing that because the Eurasian associations in Penang, in KL, and in Malacca celebrate 100 years of being in Malaysia.
Okay, so within the community itself, is there kind of consensus in the identity? I mean, there is, I'm just wondering whether there is a debate going on in terms of how to refer. I mean, there's Eurasian, there's Serani. Is there consensus in how to refer to the community itself? Yeah,
that's a good question because the community basically says that if you have European ancestry, you are part of the Eurasian community. For a long while, it was patrilineal ancestry that was looked at, and for a long while, the Asian side of the Eurasianness was perhaps maybe not discussed or not negotiated or not explored as much as could be. So that is where I have become involved with the community in trying to look at how we were identified.
What do you mean not looked at fully? I mean, so meaning that it was more important, your surname, if it had a European surname, that would make you have a better standing within the Eurasian community? Well,
it was recognized as more Eurasian if you had a Eurasian surname.
And the Asian part was then sidelined?
The Asian part was, to a certain extent, not given as much prominence, unless we're looking at the food. And then there's devil curry, which is really Asian, and all the other, itik tim and all that.
It's not easy for us to know our Asian ancestry because...
Which is correct as well, yeah.
A lot of us have been a Eurasian for a very long time, hundreds of years. And the first Asian ancestor quite often got baptized into the church and their name was obscured, their ethnic origins were obscured. So unless you have access to those original records, you quite often can't find it. So my earliest ancestor in Singapore was born in 1814. I think she was Malaysian, she might have been Chinese, but she was born in Singapore. Her name is Innocentia McIntyre, and that sounds very Asian, doesn't it? So she was baptized into the church. I have the original records, but they give no indication of what her original name was or what her original ethnic background was. So there are people now who are actually looking for that. They're trying really hard to find that, whether it's through looking through original records or DNA testing. So like I know my grandfather's part Sri Lankan from DNA testing because we have a full Sri Lankan cousin. We haven't figured out how yet.
I guess as society becomes more woke in terms of what white privilege meant and how it had an impact on non-white people, as we become more woke and conscious of how we should have a more just look at the world, then I think people are waking up and going, yeah, let's look at our other side of being Eurasian, the Asian ancestry.
Right. So this is, but you're talking about a context in which maybe white society dominates. But in a Malayan context, in a Malaysian context, in context of the South, the Strait settlements, for instance, where many Eurasian communities were, what was the politics, and especially around the exclusion of certain? I'm wondering if you could help us understand the hierarchies, as it were, of identity within the Eurasian community, and even the word Sarani, which is, I understand, is quite contested. Ione?
The Eurasian community, so there's hierarchies within the community. So, and this is going back more towards pre-independence days. The people who were more European in outlook, in appearance, the way they spoke, the way they behaved, were usually seen as being a slightly higher status, especially if they were lighter and fairer. But part of that is from the external factor, so how people saw us. We were lower than the Europeans and sort of in between the Europeans and the Asian communities. It was a very sort of fraught position to hold within the society.
Right, and that also, because it redoubles on the question of migration, right? And in particular, your lineage, which goes to Australia, the White Australia policy. Could you tell us how that impacted Eurasians in their self-identity, in their choice of where they wanted to migrate to, and so on?
Okay, so immediately after the war, there was a lot of people in Malaysia and Singapore, not just Eurasians, across the board, who may not have wanted to remain here for any number of reasons. Initially, Australia had very restrictive policies under the White Australia policy, so more people went to England. So they had it could be proving that you're anywhere up to 51% or more than 75% European to be allowed access. A lot of it was based on your appearance, of course. And as it progressed into the 60s, the policy started to loosen, so more people started to migrate. And when they got rid of the White Australia policy in 1973, obviously that's really ceased to matter. But yeah, the pre-war population probably more closely identified with the notion of being British or living in a British society, an English-speaking society, a Christian community. And when things started to change, perhaps they were looking for that in elsewhere. So whether that's Australia, England, Canada, Australia is probably just the closest place that they could access and the cheapest place in terms of shipping routes or airfares.
Okay, well, we're going to continue this conversation in just a couple of minutes, so make sure you stay tuned to consider this.